Hello and welcome to Original Soundchat, where video game music is a work of art. On each episode, it's our goal to help you learn about 2 soundtracks from the world of games, as well as the people, stories, and critical tracks behind them. My name is Joe DeVader.
And I'm Peter Spezia. We're brought to you by Anonymous Dinosaur and Rhymes with Asia. It's time to appreciate great OSTs and the games they come from without getting too bogged down in music theory. Up first for our 2 games this week is an SNES JRPG that pushed genre conventions at the time, with real-time action and co-op multiplayer, 1993's Secret of Mana.
Following that is 2017's Pyre, a story of exiles just trying to find their ticket home by performing a series of rites not too far off from a game of fantasy basketball.
An odd pair of games this week, so what could the themes be? I think these games had unusual combat for their time. You look at Pyre, and it's rather different than most games that you'd expect today, but Secret of Mana at the time was almost, dare I say, revolutionary. So it was kind of big for the time, and also there are just funky character names in both games, like really weird ones, like Popoi in Secret of Mana, and oh man, don't even get me started with Pyre.
Hedwyn, Ruki Greentail, Jodariel. One of the characters you get to name yourself, sort of.
So I think that works, right? Something like that.
I think so. I think that's a fitting pair of. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes we got to stretch for these. This feels like less of a stretch than some of the ones we've done in the past. So
I think that's fair. Joe, how are you doing in this COVID-19 quarantine time?
Trying very hard and struggling to balance professional responsibilities such as classwork and work with my current vacation in the metropolis of Midgar, and not doing a super great job at that. But I'm trying. Final Fantasy VII is so good.
I played the intro again, just like to relive the demo and show my girlfriend. And like, she's just said like, is this not like really stressful for you? I'm like, well, it helps that I've played it before with the demo, but it's like, yeah, it throws you into the fire pretty early. But I'm still playing Persona 5 Royal. That's a perfect game for quarantine, but there's still a lot to that game. And I had credits roll on Animal Crossing, so that was nice.
I also got credits roll on Animal Crossing recently, so now I have started playing Animal Crossing because it gave me the terraforming tools, so now I'm actually setting up a town. It's been very nice.
But in the meantime, we're staying in, we're listening to game music, we're playing games, we're doing professional responsibilities. And in the meantime, we're following up on composer headlines. We look at the composer that we've talked about on the show, and they're still doing work. They're still making announcements. For example, Journey, which is Austin Wintory's magnum opus of video game music so far, dare I say, the Grammy-nominated Journey, it's coming to Steam on June 11th. It's also available for free for PlayStation Plus owners right now as part of Sony's like month of play or whatever, stay at home, play games sort of initiative. So if you have PS Plus, you can get it for free there if you don't have it already. But Steam, that's a new one. But we're going to have to talk about Journey eventually. It's just going to be really difficult since that's Austin Wintory, pure and simple. Maybe we'll talk about Tina Guo, the cellist that really stands out on that soundtrack.
Maybe. That's an avenue we could go. I like that. I mean, we are looking for some spots to fill now that certain things aren't happening that we were trying to coincide with. So, hey, who knows? But yeah, Journey, it should be noted, was already on the Epic Store, I believe, on PC. I believe it came out as an Epic Store exclusive, and now it is no longer. It is now coming to Steam. So, yeah. Otherwise, Danny Baranowski is working on the game Industries of Titan, which is now available for early access on the Epic Games Store. So speaking of the Epic Games Store, obviously Danny Baranowski, we talked about him in the past for his work on Super Meat Boy. He's also worked on stuff like The Binding of Isaac and Crypto the Necrodancer, which that's another game that we really have to talk about at some point.
Or Cadence of Hyrule, another possible one. I mean, yeah, it sounds like this is a project they've been working on for a while, so good to see at least an early access coming to fruition there. And in the meantime of all the different things just to throw on the TV and watch, I threw on this show called 100 Humans on Netflix. And it's this show about these 3 researchers are trying to get this group of 100 humans together and trying to figure out experiments about humanity and things like that. And they bring up this musical cue. It even starts in like the first episode, even like 4 minutes in. And every episode, it seems, like when they're trying to figure out the mystery, like, let's think about, are women smarter than men or vice versa? Let's think about it. They play this sneaky music. And first episode, I'm like, that's the Paris theme from the Sly Cooper series, notably in Sly Cooper 2 that we've highlighted on this show before. And it's just like, you know what? Good on composers like Peter McConnell, who composed that theme. If they're still getting royalties from songs being licensed in any way, we've talked about in the past, weird occasions where we've heard video game music and just hearing it in different avenues where we don't expect it. It's kind of mind-blowing. But that's one such case. If you watch 100 Humans on Netflix, you get to hear a little doo-doo, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. It's like, oh man.
What a weird place to pull a song from. Because, like, Sly is not super mainstream. Maybe that's why. I don't know. Somebody, like, it's one of those things where somebody working on that show is a fan of Sly. There's no other way that happened.
It's gotta be. Yeah, absolutely.
My favorite is still news reports where, like, Kokiri Forest is playing in the background, and everybody's like, you did not license that song. There's no way in hell.
Just Nintendo songs in general, for sure. Let's talk about our first game this week. It is Secret of Mana. And for years, I feel like I and other people, we talked about a couple weeks ago with Final Fantasy VII, right? How we thought for years it was Mako. And then an official source comes around and says, no, it's Mako. Well, I feel like it's the other way around here. I hear so many people, and I've thought in my own headspace for years, I've always thought Secret of Mana. With the softer A as opposed to the mana, the more nasally A. Well, whether it's the remake of this game in 2018 or the Trials of Mana game, when you hear official marketing say it as Mana, you kind of have to like drill it into your brain, I guess. So I apologize if I slip and say Secret of Mana. I'm trying to undo years of mental association there, I suppose.
This is also new information to me, I'll be real. I also have thought it was Secret of Mana pretty much since the first time I ever heard the title.
So, the Mana series is known as Seiken Densetsu in Japan, which translates out to The Legend of the Sacred Sword, which makes sense. Densetsu is in Zelda no Densetsu for The Legend of Zelda. Sei in Seiken is often referred to like holy or sacred, and then Ken is like generally a weapon. It can be a fist, it can be a sword. So it kind of translates out that way. Now, the original Seiken Densetsu in Japan was originally envisioned as a Famicom project in 1989. It was apparently going to be a game where like they were going to put it on like 5 discs, and it was going to be like really big for the time, but it was eventually just retooled as what was a Final Fantasy spin-off that ended up being an action RPG for Game Boy. Now, this 1991 release would have put it just before the release of Final Fantasy IV in Japan. So it was released as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden in Japan. North America knew the game as Final Fantasy Adventure, and in Europe, the game was known as Mystic Quest. All 3 different names. Very, very interesting. Just for Seiken Densetsu. But it was the next game in the series, however, where all Final Fantasy pretense was dropped, and the Mana series could become all its own. So, Seiken Densetsu 2 was released on August 6th, 1993 in Japan on Super Famicom, while Secret of Mana was released on October 3rd, 1993 in North America on SNES, and November 24th, 1994 in the PAL region. So a little bit more than a year later for those PAL folks. Oddly enough, the English version of the box art claims that it's, quote, the first game in a new action-adventure series. Not entirely right, but sure, for the sake of branding it as Mana Westward, I guess that makes sense. If you're trying to play the game today, I suppose the easiest way to play it would be through the Collection of Mana, which was released for Nintendo Switch in Japan in June 2017 and the rest of the world in June 2019. Yes, that was part of the E3 2019, all the first 3 games in that series, out today, Collection of Mana on Nintendo Switch on the eShop. But it was a full 3D remake of Secret of Mana that was released for PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, and PC in February 2018. 2 mixed results, let's just say. I think generally people liked to see it kind of brought up in a 3D world in a sense. But one of the biggest complaints was actually the soundtrack, and we'll get to that a little bit later. The original Secret of Mana Seiken Densetsu 2, developed and published by Squaresoft. Secret of Mana is a top-down, 2D Japanese role-playing game, very similar for those Square RPGs at the time. But unlike the turn-based combat of other similar JRPGs at the time, the game features real-time combat with a power bar that goes up and down, and based on the timing of button presses, that's how much damage you can deal with your sword if you're using your sword as the main character. You can pause time, essentially, with a ring command system that pops up with actions that circle your character that you can cycle through to use special abilities. And in addition to the real-time combat of this JRPG for 1993, there is also multiplayer. Drop-in, drop-out, co-op multiplayer. See, there are 3 main characters in Secret of Mana, and you think, well, there are 2 controller ports on Super Nintendo, on an SNES, or Super Famicom. Well, I guess apparently according to this Super Multitap accessory, which the way I looked it up and kind of drew comparisons, it's like a USB hub in a sense. You like plug it into the second controller port and it gives you like, I think maybe 4. It gives you multiple more controller ports to plug into. And so through this, you could have up to 3 players playing simultaneously in this real-time combat JRPG for the time. So it was just like, unlike anything else, before Final Fantasy VI, and it's still turn-based, before Chrono Trigger in 1995, which I think would be the similar comparison to like a real-time like, even though that had ATB, but still, very unique game for its time. The story of Secret of Mana, it's a high fantasy world, which contains an ethereal energy source named Mana, where 3 local boys from the small Potos village are disobeying their elder's request by trespassing into a local waterfall where a mythical treasure is said to be kept. One of the boys, who's the elder's adopted son, is called to pull this treasured sword out of a rock by a disembodied voice, and him doing so causes monsters to appear in this Potos village. Now, the boy is banished from the village because of this, seeming that it's a bad, terrible omen, and yet he encounters a traveling knight named Gemma, who recognizes the blade as the Mana Sword. Gemma encourages the boy to seek out the 8 Mana Temples to fully power up this sword of legend. On his quest, the boy will encounter a girl who is in love with a warrior named Diluc, and an amnesiac prankster Sprite. All the while, the reigning empire of the area is looking for these mana temples and their seeds within as well, to restore their power in the world and rebuild their mana fortress airship. What will the boy, the girl, and the Sprite go through? And what truly happens when all 8 mana seeds are unsealed? Joe, this is where I'll ask you, what are our experiences with Secret of Mana?
Not a damn thing. Like, everything you just described about the battle system, I had no idea. I knew it was an action RPG. I didn't know about the power bar thing. Didn't know about the ring command thing. I knew it was co-op, because that's like one of the most famous parts of Secret of Mana. And I've heard of the game, but I've never played it. Until today, I had never heard any of the soundtrack. I think it's one of those games that was on me and Ben's list at one point of like, yeah, well, we should play this co-op sometime. At some point it was that and Crystal Chronicles, I think, are the 2 like co-op JRPGs that we've been like, yeah, we gotta play, but I've never played Secret of Mana. I have absolutely no experience with it at all.
Yeah, I don't have any experience playing it either. And it makes it very interesting to talk about, but also really interesting to learn about. I agree that the co-op is probably the most famous thing about it, and it makes it very appealing to try to go back and play with someone. I feel like that's very interesting. But I feel like it's also one of those really legendary soundtracks for the time, like trying to do new things, breaking new ground. And it must have just been a Square thing at the time, because you compare it to Final Fantasy VI, compare it to Chrono Trigger, and Secret of Mana is right up there in the soundtrack category during that SNES time, where it's among the better games, it's among the better soundtracks, and I feel like it's notable in that regard, but yeah, I do not have any personal experience with it. So that being said, I knew about a boy, a girl, and a sprite, and I knew some things about the combat, but apparently, I did not know this, the Japanese release of the game only names the 3 protagonists in its manual, while the Western versions omitted the characters' names until an enhanced port on the iOS came out. So the boy is named Randy, R-A-N-D-I, or sometimes it's just anglicized as Randy, R-A-N-D-Y, but R-A-N-D-I. The girl is Prim, or Purim, but P-R-I-M-M, and the sprite is Popoi, P-O-P-O-I, or sometimes an E added on to the end. So Randy, Prim, and Popoi are the boy, girl, and sprite. We mentioned during the Chrono Trigger episode that there's a connection with Seiken Densetsu 2 and Chrono Trigger, in that, according to producer Hiromichi Tanaka, this project of Seiken Densetsu 2 was originally actually intended to be Final Fantasy IV, with more of an action-based dynamic overworld. However, it, quote, wound up not being Final Fantasy IV anymore, but instead became a separate project codenamed Chrono Trigger.
Right, now I remember. That came up during the Chrono Trigger episode.
And you had mentioned how Chrono Trigger was in the code for Seiken Densetsu 2 because it was the code name for the project. Eventually, it would become its own thing with Seiken Densetsu 2. Chrono Trigger would become its own thing, but Tanaka said that it always felt like a sequel to Final Fantasy III for him. Here's some more interesting clash with video game history. Secret of Mana was originally intended to be a launch title for the Super NES CD-ROM adapter. Yes, this is the failed partnership between Nintendo and Sony. But when the add-on was canceled, it was cut down to a standard Super NES cartridge, which meant that a lot of the ideas for the game had to be cut. Eventually, these features ended up appearing in other Square titles. I would say some of them being Chrono Trigger. But it was estimated that about 40% of the game was cut to fit all this into the cartridge, including ideas such as multiple routes and different endings. Yeah, sounds like a Chrono Trigger to me. And it was ultimately the limitations of the cartridge itself and the difficulties they had fitting everything in at the end that just may have been another reason why Square Games, as we talked about during Final Fantasy VII, ultimately moved to the CD-ROM based platform of the PlayStation. Here's another comparison to Final Fantasy VII, because Square localization must have just been terrible at the time. Surprise! It's a Square game with awful localization. The English translation of Secret of Mana was completed in only 30 days.
What?
Which was mere weeks after the Japanese release of the game. It was speculated that it was done so to complete the game for the 1993 holiday season.
That's not enough time. 30 days.
Well, it gets worse, because the English version of the game uses a fixed width font, which means that it limits how much text can appear on the screen at one time. As a result, according to translator Ted Woolsey, a large portion of the game's script was cut out in the English localization due to these space limitations. Like, had to be basically bare bones in communicating what is going on and leaving out a lot of context. Also, like Final Fantasy VII, these lines were given to him out of order. Like he said, quote, like shuffling a novel.
What the hell? Square.
Because of all of this and the tight deadline of the 30 days, Woolsey noted how the project, quote, nearly killed him.
And keep in mind, when we talked about Final Fantasy VII, one of the things on there about it was that the only reason this changed, the quality of Square localizations changed at all, was because Final Fantasy VII was successful in the West. So this didn't get fixed until 1998.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and this one was just as bad, if not worse.
Wow.
But the game was reviewed very well, with a game rankings average of about 87%. The graphics and the multiplayer were praised, as well as, quote, some of the best music I've ever heard from a cartridge. Very high praise for 1993, though some criticisms included the, quote, unnecessarily long sword powering up, and the, quote, awkward item selection method. Many reviewed this game as saying, this is even better than The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which I feel is a common comparison because, top-down adventures, but it wouldn't be the last one with Final Fantasy VI, with Chrono Trigger. So to have it stand up in that echelon is pretty notable. According to Square Enix, as of February 2004, Secret of Mana had shipped 1.83 million copies worldwide, with 1.5 million of those being shipped in Japan and 330,000 abroad. Edge magazine at the time had noted in November 1993 that the game was the most widely covered game of the year in Japan, with a high number of sales, but when it was released in North America, it was completely unhyped and mostly unheard of. Despite this, Secret of Mana went on to become the second best-selling Super Nintendo game on Babbage's, that's a name from way back, Babbage's North American chart in October 1983, behind only Mortal Kombat. Granted, this was also a time where awards were very different then, where magazines, I guess, had more sway. Electric Gaming Monthly and GamePro gave the game its RPG of the Year award in their year-end awards. Often, Secret of Mana is noted among the top 10 to 20 best Super Nintendo games of all time, depending on who you talk to. Even among the best RPGs of all time. IGN in 2017 pulled together a list of best RPGs of all time, putting Secret of Mana at number 7. And I feel like this really defined the Mana series, really established what it is going forward, especially because coming from an action RPG on Game Boy, granted, Seiken Densetsu, a Final Fantasy adventure, this really solidified what the Mana games could be. And it was followed up by its 1995 sequel, Trials of Mana, which for a long time was only available in Japan until it launched in the Collection of Mana. A 3D remake of Trials of Mana launches this week, in fact, on April 24th, 2020, for PS4, PC, and Switch. That's about all I have for research on Secret of Mana, but let's talk about that soundtrack, which was so well regarded for the time, and that's because of composer Hiroki Kikuta. Hiroki Kikuta was born on August 29th, 1962, in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. He first became interested in music at the age of 10, after hearing songs by Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, or otherwise known as ELP. They're a 70s prog rock band that has also influenced the likes of Koji Kondo and Nobuo Uematsu. Kikuta began writing his own songs about 2 years later, at the age of 12, and taught himself acoustic guitar after being inspired by country blues music. That's an odd choice, but okay. He went to university at Kansai University, and he earned a degree in religious studies, philosophy, and cultural anthropology in 1984. So, that whole backup plan. Because he had never really received any form of formal musical training. Instead, he just taught himself music by reading music theory books and listening to a wide variety of musical genres. He did not jump right into composing right away, though, and this is always interesting to see if it's shared. What did they do after university, especially when they go and study something different at university? Hiroki Kikuta spent his next few years after school working first as a manga illustrator, specifically for the series Raven, under the pen name Yuki Nijuroku, and then as a composer for different anime series, including The Adventure of Robin Hood and The Legend of Snow White. He wanted to first work, when it came to game music composition, he wanted to work at Nihon Falcom, but then he just applied to Square without expecting to be hired. They had many applicants for the job he was going after, and he had never really played any of the company's games. And yet, at the interview, Nobuo Uematsu was attracted to their shared love of prog rock, and Kikuta was chosen over 100 other applicants and was hired in 1991.
I feel like we have talked about somebody else who applied for Square, and during one of the interviews were like, yeah, no, I hadn't played any of the games when I applied. I think it was Yasunori Mitsuda, who had never played a Final Fantasy game before applying to work for Square Enix. Or for just Square at the time. It wouldn't have been Square Enix yet.
Yeah, and that's amazing. Like, they got the job, did great work, honestly. Kikuta started off debugging Final Fantasy IV, and then creating sound effects for Romancing Saga. After Kikuta left Square in 1998, he started his own video game company called Saknoth. He worked on a game called Kodelka. And he was not just the composer, he was the concept designer, game planner, scenario writer, producer, and composer. He left Saknoth as its CEO after the project's completion, though, after which the company changed its name to Nautilus, and they worked on the Shadow Heart series before folding in 2007. In March 2001, Kikuta founded Norstrilia, which serves as his private record label, publishes his albums of self-produced work. He finds composing music to be natural, like breathing, he says, and he considers it to be his vocation. He doesn't really worry about the style of music that he composes, considering it really only to be a tool or a method. So as a result, his music is frequently composed of just a different combination of styles, all mixed together, not really one pure thing. It's a whole range of sounds for Hiroki Kikuta. Rather than trying to be a pure artist that creates art for art's sake, he says his primary goal in composing is to entertain the listeners, and you gotta appreciate that approach, certainly. His biggest musical influence, apparently, is Pink Floyd. You can find him on Twitter at Hiroki_Kikuta. The discography for Mr. Kikuta: Secret of Mana, of course, also Trials of Mana. He did like 3 times more music because he had someone to help with like the arrangement or like the coding of the sound. So that's another big one. And then his last game at Square was Sokaigi. There was also Kodelka, of course. He worked on Shining Hearts, and he's also the composer on Indivisible, the recent Lab Zero game. So I found that interesting that he's still composing for games, especially as the solo main composer. But he's also contributed to games like Soul Calibur 5, Atelier Eska and Logi, Alchemists of the Dust Sky, and Rise of Mana. Some interesting notes about Secret of Mana's soundtrack and its development. Kikuta was originally chosen for Secret of Mana after Kenji Ito, who had composed the first game in the Mana series, was forced to drop the project due to other demands, such as the soundtrack to Romancing Saga. Because Nobuo Uematsu ran Square's music group at the time, and he ran it as a separate division inside Square, at least from the game developers, Kikuta really had the freedom to approach this score however he wanted to. And he did something really interesting on the tech front. Instead of creating like MIDI versions of his compositions and then kind of carrying them over to, how would they sound on a Super Nintendo? And kind of adjusting from there. This is what I guess most game composers did at the time. Kikuta made his own samples that matched the hardware capabilities of the Super Nintendo. So he knew from scratch what his pieces would sound like, and it kind of cut out a couple extra steps, I would imagine. That's really interesting. I found that very fascinating, especially when there are reports that Kikuta would spend almost 24 hours a day in his office working on the music.
That's not healthy.
it's not. And that's Japanese work culture sometimes for you, especially in earlier days. He would alternate between composing and editing to create a soundtrack that would be, according to him, immersive and three-dimensional. He credits a whole lot of the musical imagery of the game to visiting several islands of Fiji, as well as music from Bali. Ultimately, he had the goal of creating an original score which would be neither pop music nor standard game music. And I feel like it really does stand out. So, what does the music from Secret of Mana sound like? Let's get into the 5 critical tracks, and we'll start with Fear of the Heavens. Occasionally you hear this titled Angel's Fear, but Fear of the Heavens has the Japanese title of Tenshi no Koare. And this is the title screen music. Apparently it also plays when King Truffle is reciting the legend and when you find the mana tree. When you boot the game, apparently it has like this whale sound associated with it. And some places have the whale sound before the piano comes in at the very start. But I guess the whale sound is like a whole separate sound file on the game's ROM or something like that. But yeah, so it has the whale sound appears with the Squaresoft logo. And then when you hit the black title screen with the Secret of Mana logo, the piano starts. And then there's the big orchestral swell. And that's when like the graphics open up a little bit. And it was like a big deal apparently at the time that it was timed like this so well. Like composers just didn't really do this at the time, especially for the title screen. And this was, based on the hardware limitations of what could be loaded in time. So Kikuta composed this track specifically to sync up with the screen. And, from his producers and all that, just big kudos for doing this. But yeah, this is probably one of the most famous pieces, I would say, from Secret of Mana. Starts with this gentle piano, moves to, the flute playing the melody with string support, bass going on. It's one of those melodies that I guess for those that have deep associations with this game, like it just brings you right back. And I feel like it was a really important one to include on this list.
So we hear about like hardware limitations affecting music from games of this era all the time. But it's a new one to hear that this one was specifically affected by a graphics load-in limitation. That's never a problem I've ever heard before. What a cool story and reasoning for why it sounds like this.
And it just kind of brings the player into that world. Sounds so mythical, and yeah, it gets you ready for a big adventure. The next one that really caught my ear for the Critical 5, this is What the Forest Taught Me. This has a Japanese title of, okay, here we go, brace yourself. Mori ha oshiete kureta koto.
Hey, not bad.
This apparently plays throughout the bulk of the Upperland area. And it's such a simple, happy little song that just starts off simply with these 2 flute lines, and then it just builds layer and layer and layer. Apparently, since Secret of Mana uses all 8 channels of the SNES sound chip, sound effects must interrupt music during gameplay. It was a problem that we've talked about before, and how oh, Final Fantasy VI found some way to work around it, but it was still an issue here. Apparently, this is relatively unnoticed in most places of the game, but is rather obvious when you kill an enemy while this song is playing. Just thought that was particularly notable. I think it's just for how many layers this ends up building. Yeah, it starts off with a couple. I mean, that's fine, but it eventually gets pretty complicated. And it's a happy little theme. It's one of these kind of tunes I think that just makes you feel like, yeah, that's classic 16-bit JRPG sounding.
This is my second favorite song on your Critical 5. It's really weird that this song is causing my brain to be like, oh yeah, it reminds me of, and then that space is blank. My brain is not going like, oh, it's very unique sounding. It's saying specifically, it reminds me of something, but I could not tell you for the life of me what it reminds me of. But it's a very nice, happy, cheerful piece. And it's very fun to listen to, honestly. It's very catchy. I caught myself whistling it after listening to it for the first time a couple hours ago. So,
yeah, and I feel like it did that for me too, and it's why I included it, honestly. I feel like it is a good comparison to like we keep talking about Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, but some of the forest themes there, I feel like it has a similar kind of at least instrument set to it. Maybe there's a similarity there, but this is definitely a more upbeat, happy tune for sure. But then it's serious business time, because number 3 on the Critical 5 is Danger. With the Japanese title of Kiki, this is the boss battle theme. Plays during most of the bosses during the game. And when we talk about like the sound effects or the music snippets that are just incredibly stressful, I'm sure Sonic drowning music is up there, right? But I have to imagine that the intro to this song is right up there. Because wow, that hits you early, and it's like, yeah, you're in a fight for sure. Certainly, YouTube commenters pick up on this. One of the top-rated comments on some versions saying, quote, "Diarrhea while stuck in traffic." That's accurate. But once it actually gets into the piece, the drums are going ham. Just going nuts. It really does feel like a boss battle piece, but then you get about a minute or so into it, and it really builds this triumphant fanfare that you're just actually feeling like a badass when you're dodging things and you're winning the fight. But then it goes right back to the so I feel like it's, when you're talking about songs from this game, it's another one that a lot of people point out and say, yep, this is a critical piece.
So like the diarrhea stuck in traffic part, cannot believe that was a sentence that just came out of my mouth describing a part of a song. That part, for some reason, reminds me of Zelda boss fight music, like old Zelda boss fight music. Which, hot take, old Zelda boss fight music pre 64 is not great. But that's what that reminds me of. But then after that, it gets into the more triumphant part, and that's old school Final Fantasy, to a T.
Oh, yeah.
Right there. You can definitely see the root. I don't know if Kikuta would have been working on this when it was Final Fantasy IV, but you can definitely see the roots there. 100%.
Absolutely. It's a really strong piece, for sure. Number 4 on the Critical 5. This is Leave Time for Love. Leave Time for Love is known in the Japanese title as Ai ni Jikan o. This plays inside the Mana Fortress, the last dungeon, so to speak, of the game. And boy, if this isn't just a catchy, classic-sounding JRPG song. Like, this is 16-bit JRPG at its finest. And I feel like a lot of people, at least based on the YouTube comments and just the general conversation around this game's music, have a lot of fondness for this. Like, yeah, you're going through, end game stuff, and it's kind of like, in a way, like this happy piece. Some people say, leave time for grinding. Fair. But like, this is, I feel like it's like I've heard this song without ever hearing this song before.
I kind of have very similar feelings to it, honestly. This is my favorite on your Critical 5. I think I like this one the best. It kind of weird to hear that it's just a dungeon song, but all right. I think the closest parallel I can draw is like the Epoch music from Chrono Trigger.
Yes.
That's when you're flying the Epoch, and this sounds very similar to that. This song is great, and even just listening now to refresh myself once more, so I make sure I'm talking about the right song, which I have to do because my brain don't work great. I was like starting to sort of dance to it because this song's ridiculously catchy. It's really like disgustingly catchy, and yeah, it's really good.
I feel like it's that drum that is very deliberate to keep the pace going. And it's here where I'll mention that the remake's soundtrack is generally seen as not great, that they did a bad to many of the songs here. Like, tried a little too hard to try to modernize certain things to the point where a lot of people just actually leave the original Secret of Mana soundtrack playing, which fortunately that's an option in the remake. But so, like, for example, this is what Leave Time for Love sounds like in the 2018 Secret of Mana remake. And then it's like, sorry, you went overboard and it just doesn't sound good anymore.
A little bit. I don't hate it, but I definitely prefer the 16-bit version by far.
Wrapping up the Critical 5, number 5 here, this is Meridian Dance. With the Japanese title of Shigosen no Matsuri, this is the final boss battle theme. And I feel like this is one that I will recommend listening to the full piece. It was tough to pick only 30 seconds. It is such an upbeat and intense battle theme, especially for final bosses. And, JRPGs of that era are known for having like the epic, dramatic boss battle, final piece. But like the bass is rocking it here. It's so triumphant and you feel so good, I would imagine, battling alongside to it. It's a piece that really makes me wish I had experienced it actually in my childhood. And I feel like a lot of YouTube comments echo this same thought, where it was like, oh man, I'm 10 again. Like the thought of, being victorious while this song is playing, how good that must have felt as a kid. I feel like I missed out on that.
Once again, you can definitely feel the Final Fantasy influence on this. But like, what What demon did Square make a pact with to have back in the day gotten the best bass MIDI possible?
Oh, it's incredible.
Because I feel like that's a standout in almost every Square soundtrack from back in this period is the bass MIDI. Every time.
It's always so good. And yeah, wow, something special in the sauce there. When it comes to tracks on the cutting room floor, I have a couple here. My first one is Mystic Invasion. Mystic Invasion has a Japanese title of Seinaru Shinyu, and this is one of the main palace themes. Apparently it can be heard in the Underground Palace, the Palace of Darkness, the Palace of Light, and the main entrance to the Sunken Palace. I feel like this one caught my ear immediately as just, it's such a cool groove, especially when you get like some of these low chords and tones. And then the drum rhythms really pick up with like this double bass pedal. Like it's some cool vibes going on with this one. It's like, yeah, I can see that being a 16-bit temple theme for sure, but the drum is something special. Really, really neat. Meanwhile, the other one is Prophecy. And whoo, this is an interesting one. The title to this one in Japanese is Yokan. It plays when you are flying with Flammy, and Flammy is like this dragon beast that you get as an airship-like creature at the end of the game. This is apparently after the Sunken Fortress has gone beneath the ocean and the Mana Fortress has risen. But it's a really interesting piece in the sense of its time signatures. You have these two main melodic motifs, and like just really fast-paced notes going here. But it's shifting between 5/8 and 4/8 time. I thought that was really cool. It's another happy sounding piece that feels like it fits right in with the JRPG while like being its own thing. And yeah, 5/8 time. Woo, really interesting.
I think this one is definitely a huge standout, at least for me. The beginning especially, I don't know, the way it kind of sounds muffled, like it's playing from kind of far away, almost. I don't know, I think if I had made this Critical 5, because we're both coming at this from the same spot of like, I don't know anything about this game. I think this would probably end up in the Critical 5 somewhere, though what I would cut for it, I don't know.
And I feel like that's where I was too. Yeah, it's something I wanted to mention for sure, but didn't know what I was going to cut there. Anyway, what will I never forget about Secret of Mana? Well, first of all, now how to pronounce mana. But I just think, yeah, maybe I should play this, honestly, especially if it's a co-op game, and maybe for someone who isn't as JRPG versed, like maybe one person like myself could take the lead on it. I don't know. It's a soundtrack I've heard pieces of for a long time now. And it was really neat to actually do research on it and pull it all together, but I just don't have any hands-on experience with the game, so maybe I should change that.
Maybe this is my wake-up call that, hey, I should get with Ben and do a co-op run of this game. It sounds fun. I mean, hey, action RPG, co-op, sounds like a good time.
To transition to our next game, we like to highlight a fan cover, fan remake, whether it's on YouTube or OC Remix. It's a game from 1993. Probably a lot of OC Remix songs based on music from this game. In fact, Hiroki Kikuta noted OC Remix in different like Reddit AMAs and things like that, and he's listened to different remixes of his work.
Hey!
One that I found to be really neat was a song called Smooth Mana. Or I guess it would be Smooth Mana, wouldn't it? I'm still getting there. I'm getting better. It's okay. It took me this long. This is from the OC Remix user Gux, Gux, and it's a lounge jazz piece of Fear of the Heavens. It's really MIDI. It's from like 2001, so it's a bit dated, but I feel like the roots are there for someone to do something really cool with it as far as like real recordings. Anyway, please listen to it. Please enjoy. We'll be right back.
Alrighty, time to move on to a more modern game. And by modern, I mean like 3 years ago. That's pretty modern, especially compared to 1993, to be fair. We are going to talk about Pyre, which was originally released for the PC and PlayStation 4 on July 25th, 2017. It is the third game to be developed and published by Supergiant Games. Well, it's the third game to be developed by Supergiant Games and the second to be published by Supergiant Games. They did not publish Bastion. Warner Brothers did. Speaking of, we have talked about Bastion way back in episode 3. Like, I think that was what? Bastion and Mass Effect?
Catherine?
Yeah, Bastion Catherine. That's what it was. Mass Effect was with Rockawin.
That's
there we go.
Yep.
Got there. So, while Supergiant is known for their games having a unique spin on their action game format, because they make pretty much just action games, Pyre is probably the most unique of all of their titles by a wide margin, even to date. I haven't played Hades, but I'm going to assume it is not quite as different as Pyre is. Hades just seems like a more straightforward isometric roguelike, whereas Pyre is not that.
No.
So, in the world of Pyre, criminals and exiles from the kingdom that is pretty much called the Commonwealth, that's the only thing that it's ever referred to as, so, weird name to just call yourself, but hey, not everybody needs cool kingdom names, you know? Exiles from the Commonwealth are dropped into a land called the Downside, an inescapable and harsh land where they're expected to live out the rest of their lives in misery. They're basically dropped down a river, and there is absolutely no way to get out of the Downside and back into the Commonwealth. It's impossible. We think. You take the seat of the Reader, who is a complete self-insert character. You never see their face. You never hear their voice. At the beginning of the game, you get to pick what pronouns they use. Just like of all the possible pronouns you can use, you get to pick. You also get to name them. And they have been dropped into the Downside for the crime of being literate. They can read, and that is a problem in the Commonwealth, apparently. As soon as they fall into the Downside, they are quickly met by 3 other exiles, being the human, Hedwin, the demon, Jodariel, and the dog-like cur, Ruki Greentail. Which, Ruki is my favorite because he starts the game with a little curly mustache, a tiny little mustache. And at a certain point he asks, like, hey, let me ask you something. What do you think of this mustache? And if you tell him it looks dumb, he will shave it and stop having a mustache for the rest of the game. Which is one of my favorite little character details. I forgot he had a mustache because I told him that it didn't look great. And he shaved it, and I was like, cool, we're bros, Ruki. Your newfound party convinces you to read a book in their possession, confident that it holds the secret manner of escaping the Downside once and for all. The reading of this The Book of Rites activates a map in the stars and begins a cycle of competition known as the Rites. And the Rites are the unique part of Pyre. Outside of this, it's mostly a visual novel, pretty much. With it does a weird thing where you have a cursor, and sometimes, you know how in Ace Attorney, sometimes they'll say a word and it's like a different color to highlight that word is important.
Right.
Pyre does that too, but you have a little cursor that you can take over it. So like they'll mention a location and you can hover your cursor over it and then a little pop-up will come up and say like, this is what that location is. It'll tell you about the world in that way so that characters don't have to constantly explain every little bit to you. I think it's a very, very cool system, a very good system. I wish more games would use it. The rights are where it's really at for Pyre. If I may quote Darren Korb directly, it's the best game about wizard basketball ever made, as far as he was aware at the time, which was that time was March 1st. And then I found a bunch of descriptions about the gameplay of Pyre. One article from Wired described it as a cross between Ultimate Frisbee, Dodgeball, and a Magician's Duel. IGN described it as a mix of Defense of the Ancients, or Dota, Rocket League, and Transistor. Not really sure where the Rocket League comparison comes from.
The sportiness, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, it's weird.
I guess. I don't know if I agree with that one. But like most of them are accurate. The best one I found was actually from voice actor Logan Cunningham, who describes it as Oregon Trail meets NBA Jam.
Yep.
That's 100% accurate. Fully, completely, like, that's what the game is. And they even mention in the thing I used as a source, which you sent to me, which was recent too, which I'll get to in a bit. They mention NBA Jam a couple of times. It was apparently a pretty sizable inspiration for the game, which is weird. During the rites, each team consists of a triumvirate of players, each standing in front of their own pyre, which is a large flame that represents the goal. A joke in the documentary I took this information from mentions somebody from the documentary crew is sitting off camera asking one of the designers, like, and like, what do you call the goals? And it's like, pyres. It's like, oh, right. and the director's like, the original working title was goals, but we decided not to go with that one. A ball appears in the center of the arena, and the goal is to take that ball and plunge it into the opposing team's pyre enough times to extinguish it. Whoever extinguishes the other side's pyre first wins. In terms of gameplay, only one member of each team can be controlled and move at any time, and every player has an aura. So every character has this like circular aura around them, and if a player carrying the ball comes in contact with that aura, then they disappear. They are banished from the rites for a very short time, like a couple of seconds before they respawn back at the goal. And like certain characters have the ability to like throw all the characters have the ability to throw their aura out in like a blast, but depending on the character, like some of them have like a 3-way shot. Some of them have a very narrow one, some of them very wide and slow moving, etc., etc. But this basically means that any player with the ball is especially vulnerable, because while shooting out your aura can destroy like any player, the only one that really explodes when they touch any aura is the one with the ball. So each character has their own abilities, like I alluded to earlier, both passive and defensive. And they all have their own unique move speed, their own aura size. The amount of damage they do to the opponent's pyre is different depending on what character you're talking about. For instance, the character, one of my favorite characters in the game, Sir Gilman, is an extremely fast little worm-like dude who lives in water. His people are aquatic beings. And so he has the ability to like go under the stage as if he's swimming and just move really, really fast. But when he gets to the pyre, the amount of damage that he does is very low. Meanwhile, Jodariel, the demon, is massive. She is a massive lady, and she moves very, very slowly, and is honestly a very big target. But if she manages to get the ball into the pyre, the amount of damage that she does is massive, comparatively. So it just becomes this sort of trade-off of like, all right, this one can get it in easier, but they won't do as much as this one, who's going to have a harder time to get it in, and it just becomes this really cool mix of strategizing. And you can extinguish the pyre by tossing a ball into it, but that's really, really hard. So the way you're more likely going to do it is by taking the ball and just running straight into the pyre and dunking it. With your character and all. And the cost of doing that is that when you dunk the ball into the opponent's pyre, that character then is banished for the entirety of the next round. Until another point has been scored, that character is no longer on the field. So that's another trade-off, sort of. And it's just this really interesting sort of, like Darren Crow said, it's wizard basketball. And it's massively, massively interesting. Back to the story, your starting crew picks up the helm of a former triumvirate known as the Nightwings and begins their journey around the downside, recruiting a widely unique cast of characters onto their team as they go, including characters like the Moon-Touched Girl, who you actually name, like, I named her Ray, R-H-A-E. It gives you like a list of options. I've seen people name her Bae, B-A-E, which is actually an option. Wow. And it's variations on that. Or Sir Gilman, who I mentioned earlier, Pamitha Thane, who is a harpy, basically. She's a winged woman being person. Nailed it. And just stuff like that. Eventually, they learn that their theory about the Rites is completely correct. They do hold away to end their exile and return to the Commonwealth. But only for one member of the winning triumvirate every cycle. So your goal becomes thus: battle your way through the other triumvirates in an effort to get all of the Nightwings home throughout multiple cycles of this sort of... It's a tournament. It's basically a tournament. And perhaps you may even change the world in a few ways in the process. So this is where I'll ask, what are your experiences with Pyre?
Oh yeah, I have very little knowledge of this game. Like you with Secret of Mana, I know that it's super giant, and they have their unique look and unique sound and storytelling, and that it is wizard basketball. The strategizing therein, but wow, I know so little about it, so I'm interested to hear more.
For me, I just recently played it last year because I bought it at launch when it first came out, because I owe Supergiant my life. They basically have my loyalty until they make a really bad game, and it doesn't seem like that's going to happen anytime soon. I haven't played Hades yet, unfortunately, but I need to. Pyre, I think, is a very, very good game. I think that it has the best world building of any Supergiant game, just in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has the best cast. I need to replay Transistor so I can say this definitively, but I think it is like lower than Bastion and Transistor on my ranking in terms of like playing it, because it's much longer than either of those games. And I don't think it really benefits from being much longer than those two games. But I don't know. I got to replay Transistor and I got to play Hades if I really want to say that definitively. But no, Pyre is very good. I think its gameplay is very unique. Its soundtrack is incredible. We'll get to that in a bit. And I'm very excited to keep talking about it. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to the No Clip documentary that was actually released a couple weeks ago, like on April 7th, 2020. So hey, perfect timing, No Clip. Thank you. You are a big help. The other thing is that we also happen to have already interviewed Darren Korb. And in that interview, we asked him a couple of questions about Pyre. So if you want to listen to that, you can find that both on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, but you can also find it on our podcast feed. Probably easier to find it on YouTube, but it's on the podcast feed somewhere. Just scroll down. Talks about Pyre as a game began incredibly soon after Transistor's completion, apparently, which was unusual for Supergiant because they said that they didn't start talking about Transistor until months after Bastion had come out. And this one, they were like, oh yeah, it started almost immediately. We started talking about what we were going to do next. because Transistor's success and the fact that it was their first self-published game meant that they had more freedom to, as Logan Cunningham puts it, get weird with their next game. And they got pretty weird with their next game, to be perfectly honest. And one of the very first ideas they had was to make a game about a large cast of characters, which was a departure from their previous two games, such as Bastion. You spend most of that game completely alone, and even when you're not alone, you're just sort of walking around Rux and Zia, sometimes Zulf. And in Transistor, you're completely alone. You basically do not encounter other humans unless they are, like, corrupted and boss fights and stuff like that. So this was a new concept for them. They wanted a cast, not just a player character. And this also tied into the decision to make a high fantasy game instead of their past science fiction / steampunk endeavors. Because, like, Bastion, very steampunk, I think. Not totally. But, like, it's like a weird rustic sci-fi-ish. But Transistor is solidly a sci-fi game. For sure. And so they decided to go high fantasy because this would allow character designer Gen Z to create characters of all shapes and sizes, which would give every character their own unique flavor, which was not fully present in previous Supergiant works where, as they described it in the documentary, all the characters in like Transistor were just well-to-do, slicked back, nice-looking, nice-dressed humans, basically. And another goal that they had was to make it so that the player could lose every single right. There is no game over state in Pyre at all. If you lose the right, the story keeps going, and it adapts based on the fact that you lost that right. So they wanted to make sure that that kind of thing could still be supported by the narrative, which meant that they gave the game multiple endings, multiple characters have different outcomes that can happen to them, and they also just, drove the fact that their narrative made it so that it felt all right to lose. They wanted to make sure that that feeling was there. So, like, nobody dies if you lose a right. You don't lose anything of huge importance, but, like, the characters will react to that and be like, man, it sure sucks that we lost that, or God, it sure sucks that I couldn't go home. That kind of thing. And they never really intended for it to be referred to as a sports game. In fact, they said they kind of felt a little uneasy about people describing it as a sports game. But they do fully admit that the inspiration is very much there, 100%. Though the actual concept apparently came from the desire to do the team-based experience and have the big cast of characters, and looking at sort of like rituals in general are kind of like a sport, as they put it. You got somebody overseeing it. There's an audience watching. It serves a purpose, etc., etc. The other inspiration that they had specifically for allowing one of the players to gain freedom and therefore leave your team for the rest of the game was the act of athletes retiring and the bittersweet feelings that come with it. So, like, when you play the final rite, the player that you pick first, if you win, they go home. And then you never see them again for the rest of the game. They're gone. Forever. So if it's a player that you really like to play as, it starts to become this balancing act. I liked the quote that one of them used in the documentary to describe it being, quote, "You're carrying my team, so I don't really want you to retire, but I want you to be happy." So it's like, yeah, I really like playing as Hedwyn, but Hedwyn really wants to go home and see the girlfriend that he left when he ended up being exiled. But I really like playing as Hedwyn.
But you also want to do right by him, yeah.
Yeah, and so it becomes this balancing act of that, and they said that this was a really hard thing to prototype, because you can't just make that sort of bittersweet emotion something that is evoked, without heavy story buildup. Like, people need connection to the characters. So how do you prototype that? You can't prototype, sentimentality. And so they said that for this reason, they had to build a bunch of stuff before they could even tell if this was a feeling that they were even going to be able to evoke. And they did. It does work very, very well. I think it worked out superbly in that way. It's one of the most interesting aspects of the game by far. The AI was also reworked to be a lot more complex than what they had. Previously, Supergiant AI was basically enemies saying, go to the player, hit them, rinse and repeat, keep doing that. And they needed more than that for Pyre because they're supposed to be a team playing a sport against you. They need to be able to strategize. They also wanted, like, each of the triumvirates have their own personalities to them, and they wanted that to sort of shine through when playing the Rites with them. They didn't want playing every team to feel like you were playing a canned, like, flowchart, basically. And again, they do very, very well with that, I think. Characters in Pyre, outside of one character who is voiced by Logan Cunningham and does very good. He's named the Archjustice. He's this overly pompous commentator that commentates all of the Rites. He sounds like this. Sir Gilman plunges into the fire. It's very good. He kills that role. But other characters do not speak English. They speak a fictional language that was created by director Greg Kasavin. And originally, they planned for every line to be a direct translation into this fake language. Like, full voiceover, but in a fictional language. Which sounds cool on paper, but apparently when they actually put it in the game, it just ended up being way too long. And as Corb kind of put it, it led to this thing where you'd be reading and it'd be like, okay, well, I finished reading, but the voiceover's still going and they're speaking a language I don't speak. And it just sort of felt weird, apparently. So they ended up just going for more the vocal barks or quips approach. So each character has several takes of each quip and each line and all that. And apparently there are hundreds of voice clips, just little clips that you hear every once in a while. And Greg Kasavin had to go in and hook up every single one manually.
Oof.
And Darren Korb said, like, I think it turned out really well. I don't think recording them were that bad, but I would not wish what Greg had to go through to hook them all up on my worst enemies. So Pyre would end up being announced in April of 2016 and was playable for the first time at 2016's PAX. And upon release, Pyre was positively reviewed. The PC version currently sits at an 82 on Metacritic and the PS4 version at an 85 on Metacritic. I played the PS4 version personally. Most reviews stuck in the 8 to 9 range. I think the lowest review I saw was like a 71 out of 100. And that's the lowest. And it was one. That was the only one that dipped below an 8.
I saw like IGN did like a 9.7.
Yeah, this game got some pretty good reviews, and it deserved it pretty much. It was nominated for several awards at events like the Golden Joystick Awards, the Game Awards, the New York Game Awards, the DICE Awards, the Emotional Games Awards. Hey, side note, how in the world do I still keep learning about new award shows I was not previously aware of in this show? How many are there?
I don't know. I'm tearing up just hearing about it.
The Gang Awards and the Webby Awards. It also won Best Original Role-Playing Game at the National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers Awards, where it was also nominated for its art direction and for the musical piece Vagrant Song. All said and done, Pyre was nominated for 15 total awards across the industry, according to the Wikipedia page, but the Best Original Role-Playing Game is the only one that they actually won. That's all the information I got for you on Pyre. Again, go check out that NoClip documentary. It shows like early development footage where it's obviously like assets from Transistor, where the players are all red, but like they're all red from Transistor, but like a solid color. And the ball is a beach ball from the beach scene in Transistor. Very, very funny, very good. So, we're going to talk about somebody other than Darren Korb, because again, we've talked about Darren Korb both in the Bastion episode and we interviewed him. Go check out that interview. So, we are going to talk about a vocalist that shows up on every single Supergiant soundtrack, being Ashley Lynn Barrett, which is very weird saying that last name right now in my head because I cannot say it without thinking of the character Barrett. I'm very sorry, Miss Barrett, if you are listening to this.
Are you so you hear the planet cry out in pain?
I know you can. Anyway. So, Ashley Barrett is a freelance musician, primarily a vocalist, who currently resides in San Francisco. She previously resided in New York City, where she would regularly perform in Manhattan and Brooklyn venues. She apparently became involved with Supergiant Games through an already existent friendship with Darren Korb, who she had met through their old theater company. Her first role with the company was, of course, to voice the character Zia, including, of course, performing the song Build That Wall, which ended up being the standout song from the game. It's the one that won most of the awards. It was either that or Setting Sail Coming Home, which she mentions that she was very surprised by and very pleasantly surprised by. She didn't expect it to take off that hard. I also managed to find an interview where she says that this was not her first role doing voiceover. This was her first time doing voiceover for a video game, but she also says that at one point when she was younger, she recorded a voiceover for a set of English as a second language tapes being released in Japan. And I hope those are somewhere. I really do. In the same interview, she actually says that a song she wrote about her dad called Little Birdie was actually featured in a promotion video for an Avon breast cancer fundraiser in 2008, which you can find it on YouTube. You can find that promotion. In fact, the interview that I was reading linked to the video, and you listen to it, it's like, oh yeah, that is Ashley Barrett. That's interesting. So that's real wild. She does mention that she is not a huge gamer, but she says that her work with Bastion did lead her to become more exposed to the world of video games. Before Bastion, she claims that the last game she had played was either Duck Hunt or Super Mario Bros. 3. Ooh. But she does mention a very interesting little tidbit, unrelated, that her sister apparently worked for Sega and helped launch the Dreamcast. So that's a weird connection.
Okay.
When she is not doing voice work with Supergiant, according to her website, she is writing and performing her own music and collaborating with various bands around California. Or she was. She's probably not doing that at this exact minute. Yeah, but you know. One thing that I really liked, the last thing that I found in that interview that I mentioned, was her dream is to voice a Disney princess. And she jokes that Supergiant should convince Disney to make a Bastion movie so she can voice Zia.
That'd be something.
I'd go watch a Bastion movie. I don't think that game would translate super well to a movie, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't go see it. In terms of discography, she writes a bunch of her own music. You can find most of that on her website. If you just search Ashley Barrett, that's the first Google link. But in terms of games, it's basically just Supergiant stuff. She is a vocalist as well as the voice of Zia in Bastion. She's a vocalist as well as the voice of Red in Transistor. She's in Pyre. She voices one character, maybe two characters. I don't know. I couldn't actually find a list of who voices who in Pyre, but I'm pretty sure she voices a female minstrel that shows up at the final rites. And she is also a vocalist in Hades as Eurydice, Orpheus's wife. So, as for historical development research, do you want info on the historical development and the stuff behind the general workings of Pyre? And, in fact, all of Supergiant's game library? This episode is brought to you by the interview we did with Darren Korb, where you can go find all of that information. A feast of it. It was a good interview. I promise this will be the last time I mention that. But go listen to it. It's a good time. So let's get into the 5 critical tracks. It's been long enough. Let's do this. And we got to start with In the Flame.
all are not the same, but three shall be as one. Freedom in the flame, the end has just begun. Strands may break alone, but twisted make a braid, together on their own.
I personally believe this to be / consider this to be the main theme of Pyre. The lyrics tell the whole concept of Pyre. They explain the rites. They explain that three will become as one and work together to defeat the other team, etc., etc., etc. It is the first example, I think, of how the music in Pyre is written as if they are folk songs that are regularly sung in the world, which help them do that extra world building even through the song. We asked Corb about that in our interview. I lied, I guess. I did mention it again. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm going to mention it one more time later. But this is a good example of that, I think. And I don't know. This is a great song. It's a treat to sing along to, and its lyrics are perfectly well written. In fact, my favorite Supergiant line, well, my second favorite Supergiant line of any of their songs is in this song, being strands may break alone, but twisted make a braid. I really, really like that line a lot.
I think that, with the first two games from Supergiant of Bastion and Transistor, and if people ask, well, why didn't you cover Transistor if you're going to talk about Ashley Barrett? I think that's fair. There are some great songs there. We All Become it's just amazing. But this is your choice, and we're rolling with it. But I feel like this is a good example of Darren Korb really getting to flex his songwriting muscle. At the bottom of all of it, he's a guitarist and a songwriter at heart and by trade. And I feel like this soundtrack allows him to do more with that than any of the other projects before.
I would agree with that. And I agree that the better choice would have been to do Transistor when talking about Ashley Barrett, but I feel like Transistor's soundtrack already gets plenty of... This is going to sound weird. I feel like it gets plenty of attention already. Meanwhile, I think that Pyre is probably their most underappreciated soundtrack for any of the three games that would have happened in this time period. And I really like Pyre's soundtrack a lot, and I just kind of want to talk about it, honestly. So, for critical track number 2, we have Path to Glory. This is the theme of the triumvirate The Accusers, the first triumvirate you ever fight in the game. So for that reason, it is the first song you ever hear when you first perform a rite. And this song sticks out to be super hard pretty much for that exact reason, but it also helps that it's incredibly catchy. I think it's a sitar, the dun 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 dun.
Definitely a sitar, yeah.
Oh, it's so catchy. And then you've got the guitar in the back. You've got a bass part that's really, really good. And just these heavy drums. And somehow this song manages to sound fantasy while also feeling kind of modern. And I think that's a really, really cool aesthetic to have.
Something with those stringed instruments and that heavy drum. Yeah, that's Darren Korb all over and Supergiant as far as an instrumental song for sure.
Yeah, this is one of those where it's like, I want to learn how to play the sitar now. How do I learn how to play a sitar? I'll Google that later. But then you want to go on this whole flip side, this entire change in tone. Let's get to critical track number 3, Thrash Pack. Hi there, welcome. It's in your face now. This is the theme of the triumvirate, the Dissidents, which is my favorite triumvirate in the game. They're a group of curs who aren't playing to earn freedom. They're playing to screw other people out of their freedom because they think the rites are fun. The quote that the Archjustice uses to describe them when he introduces them is, "Even now they hunger to defeat you, perhaps not simply to regain their freedom, but to deny you yours." Because they don't care. They don't care about going home. So for that reason, this song has a completely different tone to Path to Glory, because it highlights, I think this is the perfect song to highlight, that every triumvirate has their own personalities and aesthetics, and therefore the music is working double time to make sure they all fit, like, make sure all of that shines through. And like I said, the Dissidents, especially their leader, Barker Ashpaw, they're loud, they're mean, and they're really just here to spread anarchy. So like this rocking in-your-face song really, really brings that message across. I think this is my favorite non-vocal song in the game.
I was definitely surprised to hear this one come across. I'm like, that's not traditional Supergiant, but for that description, it fits perfectly well.
Yeah, it's super, super good. And most of the YouTube comments, if you scroll down in a video with this song, will be like, I was not expecting this song to play when it did, but it's awesome. So yeah, the song rules. Love it. After that, we have track number 4, Never to Return.
The favor of the scribes arrives at dawn. We shall rise again. That's the way for me.
This is probably the most important song in the game. It plays during the final rite of a cycle, after which somebody is going home. So it has this mournful sound to it. It's this powerful vocal piece because it's trying to reflect that like a hard decision is being made and the stakes are higher than they've ever been. This is my second favorite vocal song in the game. Unfortunately, my favorite ended up on the cutting room floor, but you know how it is. I couldn't not put this song on the list because it's vitally important to the game. And apparently, I didn't catch this when I played, I guess. There are 9 different versions of this song in the game, and a different one plays depending on which triumvirate you are playing against, which is super cool.
That is really neat. Yeah, you're right. It does have that mournful sound. And I'm just continually impressed by Darren Korb's quality as a songwriter. But really delivering on that front. It's so good. I think the next one's my favorite, though.
I think that is a fair choice because critical track number 5 is Bound Together.
She stayed true till the end. They follow the stars bound together, stranded unbraid till the end. Bound together,
This is the song that plays during the credits. It is presented as a folk song that is sung in the far future, that is lauding the members of the Nightwings and their accomplishments in breaking the cycle of the rites. And there are different versions of this song, depending on the pronouns you choose at the start, as well as what happened to every single character in the course of the game. According to Korb, there are 6 vocal tracks that the game can switch between depending on these factors. So while the song is playing in-game, it is dynamically looking at like, all right, what happened to this character? All right, grab this part of this vocal track and set it in here. Play that. And so apparently, everybody could hear a different song with different lyrics every time they play. And when we did our interview with him, he specifically mentioned this as one of the songs he is proudest of. In the documentary, he mentions like he's always wanted to do like a dynamically changing song. And he's glad he finally got to do it, even if it was just for the credits. So it really shows, like, not just from the dynamic lyrics thing, but just how much connection this song has to the story in general, because you really care about these characters when you hit the credits. And so hearing like all of it hitting in this song is a very proud moment, even as a player. It's a very, very cool credits theme.
That is super neat. And of course, shouts out to Ashley Barrett. The two voices, Corb's and Barrett's together, are just magical. It fits so well with them combined. So I feel like just the harmonies here and the instrumentation, it really, really stood out to me on a first listen.
Yeah, it's a very, very good song. And it's, I don't know. I don't think it quite beats Setting Sail Coming Home.
No, I think that's fair. Yeah.
But I do think it kind of beats out Paper Boats slightly. For tracks on the cutting room floor, I have two, and they're the two vocal pieces that I didn't get to put on the list because something has to go. The first one being Morning Song.
From the plains that sleep below to the canyons open wide, hear the song of gentle morning for the lost and lonesome bride.
As far as I remember, this song plays one time. And it's a very short piece. It's like a minute long. But what really makes this song really impactful to me is there is no instrumentation at all. And so like the mix of Barrett and Corb's vocals is all there is, and it carries the song so well. It feels so melancholy and cool, and I love it. Love this song. And then my other song on the cutting room floor is actually my favorite vocal song in the game. It is Vagrant Song.
Before the salt and roiling sea, the moon began to cry. The valley ran with sorrowful tears and filled the waters high. The misty morning over the brine. I think this is the first vocal song you hear in the game too. In story, you are riding through a rather treacherous area, and Ruki asks the minstrel that is traveling with you, like, hey, everybody's kind of like not great morale-wise. Do you think you could maybe sing a song? Because, like, that's your thing. You're a minstrel. You're supposed to do that. And he goes, all right, I'll sing a song. And it turns out to be this song, and it's about the area that you are rolling through, which makes it especially cool, honestly. And honestly, I think this is the one that stuck out during the concert at PAX, because they did play this one. And Darren, during the concert, claimed that he was very happy with just how different the arrangement of this song had like come out. And he wasn't kidding. It was a completely different feeling from the original game. It's a lot more epic sounding in the concert form. But I kind of prefer the in-game version because it's very nice to sing, and it's got a good little guitar part, and it's a fun song.
Probably my second favorite. This one's growing on me more.
I enjoy it. So what will I never forget about Pyre? The cast is incredibly memorable. Obviously, the easy answer is I'll never forget the soundtrack, because the soundtrack to this game is absolutely incredible. There are still songs that I couldn't put on here that I wish I had. Like, I don't have any of the songs from going on the overworld because there just wasn't any room for them. So definitely go listen to this soundtrack. But outside of the soundtrack, it's the cast of characters. They're all really memorable. They all have their own fleshed out motivations and personalities, and they all work great together, and it's all very dynamic, and you can definitely feel how your choices specifically are affecting the group around you. And I think that the amount of fluidity in the story in that way is absolutely incredible. My one criticism is that I think this game has roughly 5 hours of gameplay, and the game is about 8 to 10 hours long. And that's the only problem I have with Pyre.
Yeah, but I think, Supergiant hasn't really gone wrong in any way. Like, all of their games are winners so far, and it's a good team to back and look forward to their games and their music. Because, when you're talking about games that try weird things with their combat with weird character names, with its, Wizard Basketball and Jodariel, and you get this real-time JRPG combat in 1993 on Super Nintendo with Popoi. It's a weird pairing of games, but really solid soundtracks, and it's the music at the end of the day that matters the most. So that will do it for us this week on Original Soundchat. You can find me on Twitter at PeteSpeakeasy. Joe is over at The Dobaga. The video version of the show is on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, also at rhymeswithasia.com. But it's that MP3 podcast version of the show that you want, hosted by Anonymous Dinosaur at anondino.squarespace.com. And get that podcast feed on podcast services all around the globe, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, even on Spotify. We won't tell your boss that you're listening to great conversations about great video game music. If you're working, if you're at home, just listen. You can go on a walk. You can go in your car. Wherever you get to listen to this podcast. Yeah, not only is the podcast on Spotify in a podcast feed format, but whenever there is a song that we are talking about and it's on Spotify itself, it's getting added to a big Original Soundchat playlist of all the songs that qualify. Joe, what's being added this week?
Well, as far as I can tell, both games are on Spotify. I know Pyre for sure. Secret of Mana, I believe so. I'm going to need to make sure it's not the remake soundtrack. It doesn't seem to be. I believe it's the Super Nintendo original 16-bit soundtrack. So if it's not the remake, that'll be on the playlist as well. So both of them. We did it again. Last week was a both of them one too, right?
I think so. Yeah,
it was. Yeah. Water Wine and Deus Ex.
Good guy, Square Enix there. And then, we're still working on bonus tracks. I feel like, especially as your semester starts to come to a close, we're going to start pushing out things like our best of episodes. And those are always fun to pull together. Mm-hmm. Joe, who are we talking about next week?
I will be talking about Toru Minagishi.
I will be talking about Hajime Wakai. Oh, yes. A easy theme to put together there.
And also no Spotify tracks.
Nope, probably not. So enjoy them while it lasts this week. All right, Joe, let's play us out.
So, had to find a cover of Vagrant Song, which seems to also be the one that people have covered the most. And I managed to find a pretty nice cover by the YouTube channel RGB, featuring Garrett Bannister. It's a cover of Vagrant Song. And honestly, it's pretty good. These guys have some good pipes on them. So please enjoy that.
Definitely like this one. Thanks so much for listening this week on Original Soundchat. We'll see you next time. Take care.
The place where plans scuttled her foe, the doom ship still resides. The Titan met her end on its brow, forsaken by the